Hey everybody, this is Miss Moriarty and I'm here to discuss with us our instructional video all about pesticides, as well as integrated pest management and a little bit of GMOs. So here's just a little brief history of pesticide use. We saw that pesticides were first used around 4,500 years ago. It was specifically used with sulfur in order to kill insects. Now, during the 15th century, things such as arsenic, mercury, and lead were also being used as insecticides. Now, pyrethrum and rotenone are derived from plants, which are now types of pesticides that we use currently. And after World War II, things such as DDT, Deldrin, and 2,4-D became widely used. And in the early 1970s, it was then glyphosate, which emerged to become the most popular herbicide used in the US. But actually, if you've read any articles recently about pesticide use, you'll see that glyphosate is actually cancer causing, and there is a lawsuit going on right now involving that pesticide. Now, some benefits of pesticide use is to increase food production while continuing to lower the cost. It's estimated that the price of food in the US would increase by 50% if pesticides were not used. And that's simply because we know that those pests are going to be consuming those crops, which means you're going to be losing a lot of your crop yield. And so pesticides increase the farmers' profits by minimizing their losses. Now, what's the definition of a pesticide? Well, a pesticide is a substance that's going to kill or control an organism that's considered to be a pest. We can see things such as an insecticide that usually targets insects. You can have herbicides, which typically target plants. You can even have a fungicide, which is going to target specific fungi. Now, there are also two types of those then insecticides, herbicides, and so on. We can see broad spectrum pesticides, which are designed to kill many different types of pests, or selective pesticides that are going to be designed to kill a much narrower range of organisms. However, when we spray these pesticides on our crops, oftentimes we find that they can remain in the environment for very, very long periods of time. And those are persistent pesticides versus the latter, which is non-persistent pesticides. Those are pesticides that can be broken down relatively rapidly and usually remains in the ecosystem or in the field, for example, usually for a couple weeks to maybe even some months. But persistent pesticides can last years. Now, the reason why that's such a problem is because of a phenomenon known as bioaccumulation. And so some of those persistent pesticides are found to build up over time in the fatty tissues of predators that are usually going to consume those pests. A perfect example of that was actually DDT. When an organism containing that pesticide is then eaten, the chemical is then going to be transferred to the consumer. And this eventually leads to very high pesticide concentrations at high trophic levels. And so we saw several years ago, the bald eagle was actually endangered due to DDT. DDT was sprayed upon fields of crops way back when, and those bald eagles would consume some of those pests, and over time, it built up within their systems, especially if they were eating other organisms that were consuming those pests. And it was the DDT that actually weakened the outer parts of their eggshells. And so it was very difficult for them to successfully have offspring. So we saw a decline in their population. But ever since that, we've now eliminated DDT as a pesticide, in the US, we have seen an increase in their population, but we still sometimes find DDT in certain organisms' bodies because it persists within the ecosystem for so long after being eliminated. Now, another issue that arises due to pesticides is resistance. Now, pest populations can evolve over time, meaning that they're going to most likely have a mutation in their DNA in some way that makes them resistant to the pesticide over time. right? Thinking back to bio, thinking back to natural selection, right? A pest is going to have that mutation and it's going to make them better fit for that environment, going to be more resistant to that pesticide over time. And that actually creates a phenomenon known as a pesticide treadmill. This is the cycle of pesticide development followed by pest resistance, meaning every time you now want to kill your pests, you're going to have to add more and more pesticide in order to kill them because you're just creating a pesticide resistant population. Now, how can we begin to look at our mistakes involving pesticides? How can we implement maybe a better, more sustainable plan? Well, we can look into what's called integrated pest management. This is using actually a variety of different techniques in order to minimize pesticide input. So here you'll see that we'll use things such as biological control, physical control, and a little bit of chemical control in integrated pest management. So there's lots of things involved in implementing a plan such as this. Some examples of what farmers can potentially do are things like crop rotation, intercropping. They can plant pest-resistant crop varieties. They could create habitats for the natural predators of those pests, and potentially limit their use of chemical pesticides. So here, like I was saying before, IPM, or integrated pest management, is used as a control program, and it includes 3 methods, right? Those physical, biological, and chemical control. And the goal is to not necessarily eliminate the pest population completely, but to reduce it to a point in where it's still economically acceptable. Right, and so here's just kind of a little graph here showing us right before our IPM training, our number of pesticide applications was incredibly high versus after our IPM then training here. And if you look at our yield right before our IPM training, we had quite a high yield, but even now after the IPM training, we have an even higher yield of crops because now we are using a far more sustainable method while reducing our chemical pesticide use and not necessarily forming that pesticide resistant population. Now, something that's really popular, especially nowadays, is talking about organic agriculture, right? In our slideshows, we've been talking more about kind of the industrial, conventional type farming. Well, this is kind of an industrial type farming that is really up and coming, right? Organic agriculture is the production of crops without the use of synthetic pesticides or even fertilizers. So oftentimes it's advertised as being the more sustainable type of agriculture. And then lastly, guys, I'm going to wrap up our discussion here on agricultural practices just by mentioning one more time about our genetic engineering. Remember, in the beginning of our unit, we watched our TED-Ed video on GMOs. And so if we want to evaluate the practices that we use in terms of agriculture and maintain that high yield of crops while still using this same type of land, having more sustainable methods of using it, we might need to introduce more genetic engineering, right? We know it creates a better yield. We can manipulate it to create better food quality. It can reduce the pesticide use because we can go in and we can actually provide the crop the gene to make it pesticide resistant. It can help to reduce world hunger by increasing our food production, and it can increase profits. Remember, the 3 biggest concerns, though, involving GMOs is it safe for human consumption, right? There's still lots of misconceptions about GMOs. People are still very hesitant about GMOs. It can have a slight effect on biodiversity because what can happen is if we're manipulating the genes of this one type of species, it can eventually, those genes can transfer to the natural type organisms. And obviously the regulation of genetically modified organisms, right? We need to regulate what are we manipulating. All right, guys, that is it for our discussion here on agricultural practices, GMOs, pesticides. Make sure as you watch the video, you were taking down notes. Please mark this as done. Also, please take a picture of your notes and submit it to this assignment.